For some reason, when surveyed, a surprising number of adults across the Western world expressed serious doubt over whether Jesus of Nazareth ever even existed. For decades, Christian advocates have been trotting out C.S. Lewis's famous trilemma. That given the things Jesus said about himself, he must be either a diabolical deceiver, psychologically unhinged, or else God incarnate. Supposedly those were the only three logical options: liar, lunatic, or Lord. But in recent years, it's become increasingly popular in skeptical circles to suggest a fourth option: a legend. That the stories of Jesus are historical fabrications. That Jesus of Nazareth never existed, and if he did, that he had nothing to do with the founding of Christianity. Those who promote this view are often termed Jesus mythicists, and whilst its academic defenders like George Albert Wells, Richard Carrier, and Robert Price are astonishingly few in number, for some reason, when surveyed, a surprising number of adults across the Western world expressed serious doubt over whether Jesus of Nazareth ever even existed. So what does the Christian story say about whether Jesus is history? Did Jesus really exist? Well, despite the popularity of the non-existence hypothesis on a street level and in skeptical online forums, it might be helpful to consider just how fringe this view is when it comes to mainstream scholarship. Even Bart Ehrman, certainly no friend of Christianity, set out to explicitly refute Jesus mythicists in his book Did Jesus Exist? Because despite being an agnostic Bible scholar, he argues that the evidence for Jesus is so overwhelming that to deny it would be called silly. John Dickson, an ancient historian who teaches on the historical Jesus, he went public on his social media a few years ago with a challenge that he would eat a page of his Bible if someone could name a single credentialed professor of classics, ancient history, or New Testament studies who holds a post in a reputable university anywhere in the world, but who denies that Jesus existed. To date, John's Bible remains whole. Now, my goal with this observation is not to belittle Jesus mythicists, nor simply to flex the academic muscles of the majority. And no doubt appeals to authority can fall into the trap of being unduly dismissive, substituting real evidence and arguments simply for expert opinions as though piling up academic credentials is enough to make the case. No, my point is simply to demonstrate that sometimes popular beliefs can be out of step with informed scholarly consensus. And when it comes to whether Jesus is history, this broad consensus is not ideologically driven. These academic fields are populated by non-religious scholars too, with no motivated axe to grind and often a whole range of opinions as to who Jesus really was. But this monolithic conviction of these diverse scholars that Jesus really existed, it comes down to one simple reality: the strength of the historical evidence. So what is the evidence for the historical Jesus? Well, first, we have Christian sources, the ones that make up the New Testament. Our earliest known sources for the historicity of Jesus, they come from a series of letters written by the Apostle Paul. Penned within 3 decades of Jesus' death and some much earlier, Paul makes mention of a number of historical claims about Jesus. That Jesus was a Jew, born of a woman and descended genealogically from King David himself. That Jesus had brothers, one of whom was James. That he had 12 disciples, naming Peter and John specifically. That Jesus taught on marriage. That he summarized the Jewish law in terms of compassion. And that he said he would return in glory. That Jesus shared a last meal with his disciples. That he was betrayed by one of his own. That he was crucified and buried and then raised bodily on the 3rd day from the dead. And that he appeared to a litany of witnesses. Paul's claims here are then corroborated and fleshed out further in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which were penned roughly around the same time and certainly within living memory of the events that they described. Along with John's Gospel, written decades later, these 4 biographies contain the hallmarks of genuine eyewitness testimony from people who knew Jesus firsthand. Add to this then the rest of the New Testament documents, including letters from James and Jude as 2 of Jesus' half-brothers, and you have a compelling case. Second, we have the Apostolic Fathers outside the New Testament. These are the second generation of church leaders at the end of the 1st century and the start of the 2nd century. Christians like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias, all of whom speak of Jesus and most of whom likely knew apostles personally, receiving from them their testimony about Jesus. Now, secular historians, they take these Christian sources seriously. Just because these first Christians were persuaded that Jesus was who he claimed to be, Lord, that doesn't nullify their worth as historical sources. Now, obviously, critical scholars don't take everything these Christian sources say as gospel truth, swallowing Jesus' miracles wholesale, for instance. If they did that, they'd all become Christians. No, they weigh individual claims from within these sources, looking to see if they satisfy a range of criteria so that they can confidently affirm what happens in history. But let's say you're skeptical of these sources. I mean, Christians are biased, right? Surely we can't trust the motives of these morally transformed people, the ones who spent their lives sacrificially serving the poor. Or surely we should doubt the intelligence of these witnesses who, penned some of the most incredible literature in the ancient world. But even if you are skeptical and throw out all of these Christian sources, you're still in luck. Why? Because third, Jesus is better attested in non-Christian sources than nearly anyone outside of the Roman emperors. And that is no small feat for an obscure itinerant preacher from a backwater Roman province. See, across the ancient records, there are numerous mentions of Jesus. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, the Roman historian Tacitus, the Roman magistrate Pliny the Younger, the Greek satirist Lucian, and even the Babylonian Talmud. In fact, no less than 12 non-sympathetic sources in the first 2 centuries AD mention Jesus, often corroborating some of the New Testament's claims with independent details. Now, one of Josephus's references to Jesus, the Testimonium Flavianum, is disputed because it seems a later Christian scribe edited his original words. But even cutting this out, there is plenty of secular evidence to affirm Jesus existed. In total, were you to pile up all the sources together, the Jewish, Christian, and Greco-Roman accounts, there are 42 different sources for the historical Jesus that were all penned while Christianity was still a tiny rogue religious contingent in the ancient world. So the non-existence hypothesis, the idea that Jesus was just a historical fabrication, it just does not stand up under scrutiny. There is a reason why secular scholars in this field consider Jesus mythicists to be the ideological equivalents of flat earthers, because they just don't seem to be willing to go where the evidence overwhelmingly points. And so, since truth invites questioning, you are invited to explore this historical evidence for Jesus for yourself, asking what makes the most sense of the claims in these sources. Was Jesus just a liar, cunningly deceiving those around him? Was he a lunatic, psychologically unstable and so confused about his true identity? Or was he truly Lord, and so worthy of our trust as the one who promises eternal life? Given the weight of historical evidence, it would seem the one thing we cannot say is that Jesus of Nazareth was nothing more than a legend. Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.